When you're getting started on a ketogenic diet, it's good to have something that you can reference, you can come back and look at. So this entire video will be time-stamped with very clear chapters. So you can either watch the whole thing right now, or you can save and bookmark this video and come back to little chapters that apply for given points when you're on your ketogenic journey. Okay, so I wanted to do this video as an updated 2023 version because so much has changed in the world of ketogenic research, and it's good to have a refresher to understand how to do it properly. So let's first jump in with what a ketogenic diet is if you're brand new to this or if you just need a refresher on it. Okay, a ketogenic diet is a fasting mimicking diet. Okay, what that means is we are reaping the benefits of a fast, but by having food in our system still. Because we get all these benefits that come from fasting, and we see that with epileptic patients in the early research in the 1920s, right? But we can't expect people to fast forever. So researchers found that, okay, if we just deprive the body of glucose, we can actually have these same benefits. So what the ketogenic diet is not, it's not just copious amounts of garbage meat and cheese. It's a very well-crafted diet with moderate amounts of protein, relatively high amounts of fat, low amounts of carbohydrates, and moderate to high amounts of vegetables. And now we're even seeing small amounts of fruit in there. So we're gonna go ahead and break it all down. Now, from a survival and sort of evolutionary standpoint, the reason the ketogenic diet works is because your blood glucose, your blood sugar, never goes down to zero. Okay, it's a common misconception that when you do keto and you don't eat carbs, you're gonna go hypoglycemic, and that's not the case. So what actually happens is being in a ketogenic state, as it's called, means that your liver is producing a different nutrient. It's producing ketones, and your liver is producing ketones because you are not consuming carbohydrates. So what happens is the brain needs glucose. So the brain starts sucking up a lot of the carbohydrates that are naturally floating through your bloodstream, even if you're not eating carbs. And what this would mean is that your muscles would starve, right? Well, the body doesn't want your muscles to starve. So in an effort to provide the brain with adequate amounts of carbohydrates and glucose, the body produces ketones. So the liver produces these ketones and they fuel your body and to a certain extent fuel your brain, but the primary sort of evolutionary reason behind the ketogenic state is to actually allow the brain to soak up the glucose so that our body doesn't have to. Before we get into the how-to portion, we have to look at sustainability. And fortunately now we have new data from 2022 from larger scale meta-analysis that show us, like, is the ketogenic diet sustainable? And the short answer is yes. And is it safe? And the short answer is yes. And a lot of even the opponents of the ketogenic diet have now turned a page and said, you know what, yeah, it does work equally and sometimes even better than other diets. There was a 2022 study published in Nutrient Reviews that found in the first year of a ketogenic diet, there were improvements in HDL cholesterol levels, there were improvements in triglyceride levels, improvements in fasting glucose and fasting insulin levels, and various other improvements upon lipid markers and glycemic markers all the way up until 12 months. After 12 months, it was no better than other diets, but it wasn't worse or wasn't unsafe. So the point is that you have all these amazing things that happen inside of the first year, and after the first year you can decide, hey, if I like this, I want to keep going with it, and if not, whatever, move on to something else, that's fine, you got a good year out of it. Then there was a study that was published in Diabetologia in 2022 that was a meta-analysis looking at over 20 papers, okay? And it determined that with all of this data compiled, that the ketogenic diet is a very viable dietary solution for metabolic syndrome. So for metabolic dysfunction, for mitochondrial issues, for potentially diabetes and things like insulin resistance. And the study said, and I paraphrase, quote, "The ketogenic diet is a safe diet and provides promising approaches for metabolic syndrome, even if optimal carb proportion must be explored." What this means is two really cool things. It means, hey, actually we're seeing, like, they're recognizing that it is a safe and effective diet for metabolic syndrome, and it actually works really well, even if carbohydrate proportions need to be explored. What that means is that depending on activity level, we can actually ebb and flow how many carbohydrates we have. Before, it was kind of set in stone, be like, don't have more than 20. Well, things have evolved, and I've evolved. Like, I have sometimes 50, sometimes 60 grams of carbohydrates when I'm in a ketogenic state, depending on how much I'm exercising. We'll talk about that as we go. So let's go ahead and move right in to the fun stuff. So what ketosis is not. It's not junk food. It's not processed cheese. It's not all the hyperpalatable stuff that's out there these days. It's good, wholesome food, living as close to the earth as you can, eating a whole food diet. Let me get that across. It is not what people think it is. It's not just processed meat and cheese. It's also not diabetic ketoacidosis. That is not going to happen unless you are a type 1 diabetic. Ketoacidosis comes from when you do not produce insulin and ketone bodies get too high. This is not going to happen if you are a normal functioning human that produces insulin. If you are a type 1 diabetic, perhaps you need to investigate further. It is also not bad for the kidneys, even if the protein levels are higher, which they are on the ketogenic diet now compared to what we looked at 5 or 6 years ago. There was a study published in the British Journal of Nutrition, and I quote, "Low carb diets and corresponding high protein diets are not harmful for renal function." Okay, what this is saying is based upon the randomized control meta-analysis looking at multiple papers, no issue with the kidneys by going on a low carb diet or corresponding high protein diets that go with a low carb diet. So don't be freaking out there. It's not the end of the world. What should your macronutrient ratios look like now? Okay, we used to say more like lowish protein, like 20% protein. Now that we're understanding that protein does not kick you out of ketosis, okay, it does not. Protein is still good to go, and protein might be one of the main benefits of being on a ketogenic diet. We want to lean more towards 40 or 50% of our calories from protein, and we want to have about 40% of our calories from fat, and about 5 to 10%, depending on the activity level, from carbohydrates. When you look at the fats, you should be predominantly monounsaturated fats from avocados, from olive oil, from avocado oil, from macadamia nuts. Second to that, you want polyunsaturated fats from fish oil, from omega-3s, from some other nuts and seeds, things like that. You want about 20% of your fat calories to come from saturated fat. And the saturated fat that you should be trying to get more of is things like stearic acid, which is the most benign saturated fat, if you want to call it that. You're going to get that in good quality dairy. You're going to find myristic acid in dairy. So lean towards dairy as more of your saturated fat source whenever you can. Not saying that a good, nice cut of meat is bad, but you don't want to overdo it too much. When we say protein does not convert to glucose, we used to think that excess protein would turn into sugar, that it would stimulate what's called gluconeogenesis, where your body takes proteins and turns it into carbs because the body needs it. It turns out that gluconeogenesis is demand driven. Okay, this means that the body will only turn protein into glucose if you are actually demanding it, if there is a need for it. So it's not driven by supply. So you don't just eat protein and it magically turns into glucose. You only turn it into glucose if your body is in a serious deficit need for it. And that has nothing to do with what you supply it. That has more to do with, does it break it down from your tissue or not? So, which leads to the next question. Are you going to lose muscle on a ketogenic diet? Now the evidence is fairly clear that despite mild decreases in anaerobic performance and mild decreases in 1 and 2 rep maximum strength lifts, there really is no difference between the muscle loss that you would have on a ketogenic diet or the muscle loss that you would have on any other diet. As far as the research is concerned, there's been a little bit more of a regression to the mean, demonstrating that before we used to think that ketones were crazy muscle sparing and that they would spare leucine and that you could like really be in a heavy deficit and not break down muscle. But now we're starting to regress a little bit more towards the mean as we have more research. And what that means is we see, okay, yeah, there's actually some benefits like with ketones being present where you might spare a little bit more muscle, but really, it's just like anything else. It's like any other diet. What makes the keto diet more beneficial is that you're more satiated generally and you don't have as much of a desire to eat. So it's easier to be in that deficit. And generally speaking, you're eating more protein because carbs aren't in the equation, so you have more protein available as far as your calories are concerned. So you prevent catabolism that way, you prevent muscle breakdown that way. All in all, the ketogenic diet is very safe as a way to lose weight and spare muscle, contrary to what people believe. Let's talk about how to get into ketosis here, because these are 6 very important steps and some of them have changed. The first thing I want you to do, outside of course, cutting out the carbohydrates, that's the obvious thing, stop the nighttime snacking. This sounds so minute and minuscule and nuancy, but it's very important. There are studies now that demonstrate that insulin sensitivity is jeopardized quite a bit when you eat late at night or even into the evening hours. So for the first week getting into ketosis, my stark recommendation be to stop eating at like 5 or 6 p.m. Commit to that for a week, because what it'll do is it'll allow your nighttime fasting period overnight to be a couple hours longer than it normally is. For every hour that you're not eating and you're longer into a fast, if we want to call it that, that gives you so much more horsepower in terms of how quickly you get into ketosis. So that's step number one. Step number two is increase your poly and monounsaturated fats. Don't just dive into keto and do a bunch of saturated fats in the beginning. Okay, the evidence is pretty clear, it's very clear, that poly and monounsaturated fats convert into ketones faster than saturated fats. Saturated fats take a long time to break down because they're saturated and there's lots of carbon chains that are bound together. So they have to be cleaved off, and that takes a while. Poly and monounsaturated fats are easier to break down in the body enzymatically, and therefore they also convert into ketones significantly faster. So when it comes down to wanting to create ketones fast, macadamia nuts, olive oil, olives in general, avocados, avocado oil, some good nuts, fish oil, things like that. Those are the things, and even MCT oil, although technically, in a weird way, that's a saturated fat, but that is a very complex discussion. But MCT oil is also great. Number 3, I would recommend you do 3 days of glycogen depletion style workouts. That sounds monumentally scary. No, all that means is go to the gym, do resistance training, and train a little bit of every body part. Do 2 to 3 sets of every body part. What this is going to do, it should only be like a 30 to 50 minute workout. You just want to train your whole body with resistance training, because that's going to suck up all the glycogen as much as you possibly can for those 3 days. The quicker that you can burn through your glycogen stores, the carbohydrates that's stored in your muscle, the quicker you can tap into using fat. So you have to get through that first layer of stored carbohydrates in your muscles first. And the best way to do that is glycogen depletion workouts. So go in there, do 2 or 3 sets of squats, then do 2 or 3 sets of shoulder press, 2 or 3 sets of chest press, 2 or 3 sets of lat pull downs. Just burn up the glycogen. Then after day 3, start doing low intensity cardio, like zone 2, so your maximum heart rate is maybe like 65 to 70% of your max heart rate, okay? That is going to, once the carbohydrates are depleted, aerobic activity and cardio mobilizes fat. Mobilizing fat is always a good thing, but if you're not glycogen depleted, the mobilization of fat is just going to go through beta oxidation. It's not going to go through actually going through the liver and converting into ketones. So deplete carbohydrates first with those workouts, then move into 2 or 3 days of easy cardio for 30 to 45 minutes, and you'll find you start producing ketones pretty quick. The next very important thing is during these first 5 or 6 days, increase your electrolytes. Importantly, your salt. If you're experiencing keto flu, it is generally an electrolyte imbalance, and it's because your body is losing electrolytes, because as your insulin levels get lower doing keto, you lose electrolytes. This has been known for a long time, but it's very important if you want to combat the keto flu, you keep the electrolytes high, but you also understand that this is a natural transition of your mitochondria and your cells adapting to a new fuel source. The next one that wasn't talked about as much, that's now been fairly new in the last year or so, is the importance of stabilizing the microbiome early on. When you look at the data, you see that the microbiome shifts on the ketogenic diet are disadvantaged, like they're not exactly advantageous. They're not good for the first few months. And that's because you have a radical shift to the gut microbiome. And then after 4 or 5 months, then the microbiome actually becomes more diverse and better than it oftentimes was before, especially on a standard American diet. This is because the gut biome takes time to readjust and recalibrate, especially when all of a sudden you're reducing the starches that would normally feed the microbiome. So I firmly believe that towards the beginning, it's exceptionally important to increase fiber, because the fiber is going to feed the microbiome. And I think it's also important to add a good quality probiotic in. This is a very important piece, especially during the first few months as your body's adapting to entirely new subsets of food and fuel. Okay, I put a link for the one that I recommend. It's called Seed. Very, very cool technology, and they do a lot of stuff for the low carb community. It's not a specific low carb symbiotic, It's used throughout all different diet types, but it's the one that I use and the only one that I would really recommend because most of them are pretty snake oily and pretty weird, honestly. So they do a lot of the research themselves. They put the money where their mouth is. They're really legit, and the technology is absolutely wicked cool. It has a capsule inside of a capsule, so cool technology, so you're getting proper delivery of the probiotic, and it also has a prebiotic. That's why it's called a synbiotic. So the link down below will save you 15% off if you want to try them out, which I highly recommend no matter what kind of diet you're doing, but especially if you're doing keto, you try them out. It is definitely something that can help you adapt a little bit faster. And even if you don't feel it initially, it's going to help that transition into that ketogenic state a little bit better as far as your gut and overall microbiome is concerned. So that link down below using code Thomas15 for 15% off. An additional hot tip that might help you through this whole process too is the more that you can just sip on some bone broth throughout this first 5, 6, 7 day period, the better off you might be too. You're changing things in your gut. That's going to help you out with some extra collagen and some gelatin, but it also just keeps you satiated. The next thing you have to learn is that insulin sensitivity in the beginning is your friend. Now, what I mean by that is you want to do whatever you can to help improve insulin sensitivity so that the carbohydrates that you do potentially consume, like even little remnants, get soaked up into the muscle really quick and don't float around in the bloodstream inhibiting ketone formation. If you have lots of glucose in the blood, you're gonna stop ketones. So ketones form when glucose is lower and stable and when the body has no choice but to produce ketones. So if you're insulin resistant and your cells aren't soaking up glucose, that glucose is staying in the bloodstream, standing in the way of the liver producing ketones. So we need to remain as insulin sensitive as we can. And there's a few tips that we know now that we didn't even know 5 years ago that you can apply to remain insulin sensitive. Number one is boring, and that is adequate sleep. We did not realize how much sleep played a role with insulin sensitivity. Stop eating when it's dark out so that you can sleep better. Studies are suggesting that the more you eat with your circadian cues and daylight rhythms, the better. That's an easy one. Number two is green tea. Green tea is a very potent insulin sensitivity stimulator. Okay, it does this through GLUT4 translocation, helps GLUT4 come to the surface. So overall, a very good thing. EGCG as well as the antioxidants are very powerful for that. So soak up that green tea as much as you can. Adding cinnamon to whatever meals you can during this first week especially. Cinnamon is an insulin mimicker. So it helps glucose get into the cell, again, lowering those glucose levels so you can produce ketones. Apple cider vinegar is very interesting. Okay, apple cider vinegar slows down the digestion of starches. So let's say you ate a bunch of veggies and you were concerned, oh my gosh, there's a few carbs in these veggies. Apple cider vinegar used as like a dressing or even a couple tablespoons or a shot with a glass of it, whatever, that is going to slow down the breakdown of disaccharides into monosaccharides. It affects our enzymes so we don't digest those carbs as fast, so they don't skyrocket our blood sugar as fast. Very big tip there. And a very simple one is move your body as much as you possibly can. It is called insulin-independent glucose uptake. The more you move your muscles, flexing, anything like that, walking, moving full range, that soaks more glucose up into the muscles more than any other diet tip or hack or anything I'd throw at you. Move the body, soaks the glucose up into the cells, and you can produce ketones better. How do you know you are burning fat? How do you know you're producing ketones without testing? The telltale way is you're satiated. You feel not that hungry. And ketones do that. Ketones can blunt ghrelin levels. They can reduce hunger. But also, you just feel satiated. You're not having the whole satiation obscured by glucose spikes and falls, right? So that's a very important piece. That's number one. Secondly, you notice an improvement in your aerobic performance. You notice that when you're exercising, hey, like I'm not gasping for air as much when I'm doing mild aerobic activity. I kind of feel like I could do my cardio longer. That's a very subjective but important thing to know that you're utilizing fat better. You also start noticing a radical shift in your focus. So when you first start keto, you get kind of foggy because your body's like grasping for glucose, but it's not quite producing ketones yet. So you're like, yeah, what the heck? But then all of a sudden, the brain starts utilizing ketones at the same time as glucose, and you're like laser focused and you feel it. Okay, so that is a very, very big one. And then the last one's kind of funny. You start noticing like sort of a fruity taste in your breath. That is called ketone breath, and it goes away, but it's a very clear indicator that you're not producing ketones, which leads me into the next thing. How do you test your ketones? Because a lot of the stuff out there, the ketone strips are great. Those are the ones you pee on. Okay, those measure what is called acetoacetate. The problem with measuring with urine strips is that it's highly flawed in terms of how much they measure. And when you urinate, you're only measuring excess ketones. You're not measuring your actual amount. You're only measuring the excess amount of ketones that are coming out through your urine. So that doesn't tell you an accurate picture of what you're producing. It only tells you what you're excreting. So in the beginning, when your body is ruthlessly terrible at producing ketones, it just produces a bunch because it thinks it needs to, you're gonna register this super high amount. Okay, but that's not indicative of what you're actually utilizing. And then a lot of people find after a few weeks, they're not registering on the ketone strips anymore. Well, that's because you're no longer producing excess ketones, you're producing just the amount you need, so they're not showing up in the urine. So people freak out, they start doing all this restrictive stuff, and reality is you're just testing via the wrong method. I recommend testing via blood or testing via breath. And if you're going to test via blood, use something like a Keto Mojo meter that tests beta hydroxybutyrate in the blood. And if you're going to use a breath meter, I recommend that you use the BioSense because it measures fractionated breath, which measures fractionated acetone in the breath, which is a complicated discussion, but that's the only breath meter I would recommend. Otherwise, acetone is a flawed measurement as well. And you want to have your ketone levels generally above 0.5 millimole. People are going to tell you that higher ketones is better. The research now suggests that we do not chase ketones, we chase results. Okay, if you are producing a half a millimole of ketones, that means you're still producing ketones and your body is utilizing what it needs and you don't have copious extra amounts. That's fine. The higher the ketone levels sometimes does equate to better cognitive performance, but that's not the goal generally with weight loss. Okay, the other thing that we didn't talk about in previous videos that is now a thing today, measure your glucose. Monitor your glucose. Wear a continuous glucose monitor. Measure your glucose. Don't just measure your ketones. It's called the glucose ketone index, and that's the ratio of your glucose to ketones. So the higher your ketones, in theory, the better, right? Not necessarily needs to be that way, but if you have ketones at like 2 millimole, but your glucose is also high, that means you have a poor glucose to ketone ratio. Okay, but if your glucose is relatively low, like 80, 90, and your ketones are high, that's a good glucose ketone index or ratio. So you always want to look at that. So measure your glucose too, and if you had to choose one, I'd almost recommend you choose your glucose over your ketones, believe it or not. Fat adaptation. The first 3 or 4 weeks, you can expect a decrease in performance. Okay, if you work out, you might expect a little decrease in your physical performance because what happens is the mitochondria and our cells, they need to get used to utilizing ketones. Now, ketones take a different bus into the cell than glucose does. And it's like supply and demand. It's like if all of a sudden we need a bunch of different transporters to carry ketones in, we got to build those transporters first. We can't just magically have them. So it takes time for the body to develop that transportation system. And once that transportation system is activated, then you start reaching what's called fat adaptation. And that takes in process like a couple of months to really rev up and really like 4, 5, 6 months to really reach its peak. Okay, so you'll continue to get better and better and better and better at things with keto for like 6 months. And then after that, you kind of plateau and you just enjoy it, right? Then you're adapted. It's called fat adaptation. So remember that with great power comes great responsibility, and you might have to deal with a little bit of sluggishness for a tiny bit to achieve the amazing benefit, okay? Let's talk best time to exercise to get a benefit. There's some recent research now coming out on what are called exerkines or exerkines, potato. Exerkines are molecules that are secreted by our muscles when we exercise. And there's a number of them. There's hundreds, but dozens that we really look at in research right now. And these exerkines are telling us that we get different benefits from exercise at different times. And flash forward to overall like what we need with keto. The evidence suggests that training in the morning in a ketogenic state is going to allow for more beneficial ketone formation and better glycemic response. What that means is training in the morning, specifically with keto, really works well. You'll produce more ketones and you'll modulate glucose better. You can work out whenever you want though. Just move. I don't want to get too nuancy and broken up in it, but if you want to produce more ketones, the morning is the best time for someone on a ketogenic diet. What are the best proteins to eat? Now, a lot of this has changed because we used to say just eat the fattiest cuts of meat that you possibly can, but the more that we realize with this, what we call regression to the mean with the ketogenic diet, we realize that although the human body is what's called an open thermodynamic system, meaning we still look at physics and math with thermodynamics, but we also understand that as an open thermodynamic system, our body has a lot of variance day to day with how many calories we actually need, so much to the point that it's very, very, very difficult to measure. However, thermodynamics do still apply. So what we're finding is that, okay, if someone is doing a ketogenic diet and they're only eating fatty cuts of meat and they're ending up at 4,000 calories per day and they're gaining weight and don't know why, it's tough because maybe they're getting too many calories from their meat and they don't realize it. Now, there's nuance here, of course, with the Randall cycle and all kinds of different things. That's complex, but I say that as a disclaimer because that could be misconstrued, right? Point is that I recommend going from lean to moderate fat cuts of meat. Okay, so chicken, maybe some leaner steaks, some leaner fillets, maybe some New Yorks that don't have copious amounts of fat. And if you have a ribeye, maybe have it a couple times a week or something like that. Don't be afraid of it, but kind of remember those rules about the fat quantities that I talked about. I would still argue that eggs are probably the best protein source on keto, just because the abundant amino acid profile, abundant EAA profile. Fish are probably a close second, and then kind of the other meats that kind of come in there. And then of course, if you need to supplement with some protein powders, I don't think it's the end of the world if you need to get your protein allotment up. I think one of the most important things you can remember on a newer age ketogenic diet is prioritize protein above the fats. Okay, you will have more flexibility if you prioritize protein than if you prioritize fat. If you prioritize fat, you might accidentally go overboard way easier than you would with protein. Veggies. With veggies, some of the research has changed, but a lot of what's changed is my opinion and my own experiences. I'm gonna go ahead and say if it's leafy, if it's green, if it's cruciferous, and especially if it's fibrous, eat as much of it as you want. Okay, first of all, I highly doubt that you're gonna end up with like 40 grams of net carbs from vegetables. And if you do, I actually applaud you because you're probably gonna be so satiated from that much in the way of veggies that you'll probably lose some serious weight. Okay, so even if you were knocked out of ketosis. So don't chase ketones, chase results. Stop worrying so much about that broccoli kicking you out of keto that you're missing the forest through the trees, okay? You still want to lose some weight. And I know people are anti-veggie, and I know there's the carnivore community that believes a certain thing, and there's the vegan community that believes a certain thing, but I still believe in food quantity. And I think that vegetables have a lot of benefit when it comes down to a ketogenic diet, purely from a satiety and fiber standpoint. So again, I doubt you're gonna hit 30 or 40 grams of net carbs when it comes down to vegetables. So for all intents and purposes, just if it's leafy and green, just eat it, okay? Now, regarding net carbs with everything else, you do need to be concerned with things like almonds and all the various nuts, right? With nuts, those carbs add up, and they add up quick. You don't realize it. But you know what else they add up in? Calories. 1 ounce of almonds, we're talking close to 200 calories. You see what I'm talking about? It doesn't take much, and it's a small handful, and you're like, there's 200 calories, there's 200 calories. I just don't think you should lean into nuts. And if you do lean into nuts, lean into macadamia nuts that seem to be more satiating and at least have a more of a metabolic benefit. They're also one of the lowest carb nuts. So definitely recommend macadamia nuts. Macadamia nuts, pili nuts, sacha inchi seeds are sort of my big three when it comes down to the nuts that you would eat a lot of. And the good news is they're kind of expensive, so you're probably not gonna eat a ton of them anyway. So instead of saying almonds are cheap, so I'm gonna eat a crap load of those, say I'm gonna go for the expensive nuts so I don't eat a lot of them and get more of a benefit. Just trust me on that. Fiber should be a priority shortly behind protein. I think protein before fiber. But fiber, here's the interesting thing. Especially if it's soluble fiber, I think you're going to be able to get away with a lot more than what people think. Okay, fiber ferments in the gut and it converts into something called butyrate, which is a short chain fatty acid, which if you want me to get biochemical on you, butyrate is only one hydroxy group away from beta hydroxybutyrate, which is a ketone body. And there's some rodent model evidence from decades ago that actually suggests that butyrate may actually help promote beta hydroxybutyrate formation. What that simply means is more fiber might actually help you produce more ketones. And I have experienced that firsthand anecdotally. So I can't scouts on or say that this is exactly what the research says and 100% evidence-based, but I can say it's partially rodent model evidence-based and Thomas DeLauer anecdotally based. So aim for the fiber, go for the skies, go all the way. Interesting newer stuff surrounding fruit, specifically berries. Fruit is made up of a couple of different types of sugar: fructose, glucose, and sucrose, which is a hybrid of fructose and glucose together. You want to opt for fruits that have more fructose. Fructose does not spike insulin, or it does in a very small amount. So fructose does not inhibit ketogenesis when it's in a small amount. So you can get away with having probably up to 3/4 of a cup or a cup of fruit per day. especially if it's right before or after a workout. I'm gonna leave that right there and just let that stew, because sometimes that fruit is all you need to satisfy that sweet craving. And test your ketones. If you eat the fruit and it kicks you out, then maybe you shouldn't do it. But I can almost argue that most of you are gonna be able to have some fruit. The best sweeteners, in my opinion, this is revamped a little bit. Allulose is one of my favorites now. Okay, allulose is interesting because it also has the power to sort of bind to the same transporter that glucose would bind to. So if you sprinkled some allulose on fruit, you could actually reduce the amount of carbohydrates that are absorbed into the bloodstream from the fruit. Okay, so allulose is one of my favorites. Next up is going to be monk fruit. Shortly after that is going to be stevia. Then kind of bottom of the barrel, I like it, but it just barely makes the cut, is erythritol. Erythritol is still a sugar alcohol. I still think that it's not the best thing if you're gonna have a ton of it, but I think little bits here and there for baking and stuff like that, totally fine. What drinks can you load up on? Coffee, tea, heck, you can have diet soda if you want. Let's just make it easy. I don't think it's the best thing, but sure. Things like Zevia, things like carbonated water, those are all fine. Okay, just avoid things that have carbs. Okay, I love to drink like just sweet tea that's sweetened with like stevia or something throughout the course of the day. Alcohol is going to take priority from the liver to digest it and to deal with it, to metabolize it. Okay, it is a poison, it is a toxin, so that means ketone formation and all other forms of metabolism take a back seat to the alcohol metabolism. Okay, lots of studies now demonstrating suppression of melatonin, suppression of overall digestive enzymes, all kinds of things, elevations in cortisol that are chronic, affecting pancreatic cells, okay, through kind of like changing diversion of blood flow. Alcohol, not good stuff when it comes down to insulin resistance, when it comes down to ketone formation. So I would just say 1 or 2 times per week, try to limit the amount. I know there's keto wines and things like out there, but remember, you're missing the forest through the trees. Keto is good because it forces you to go back to whole foods and really being like authentic with what you choose. So if you're making the concerted effort, then try to reduce the alcohol. Every 8 weeks, you should reevaluate your calories. Okay, because every 8 weeks, the body tends to kind of shift metabolically, not on the clock, but roughly based on research every 8 weeks or so. What this means is if you are looking at your calories and you're really having low calories at 8 weeks, you might want to take a 2-week break and then go back for another 8 weeks. It's called a diet break, and 8 weeks seems to be the magic number. So diet for 8 weeks, then take 2 weeks off. That 2 weeks off does not mean that you need to add carbs. It just means you increase your calories. You're not magically losing weight because ketones are magical. You're losing weight because of thermodynamic effects, but also just because of various different open thermodynamic systems, the Randle cycle, and a number of other things that come into play with the ketogenic diet. Take a break now and then, especially every 8 weeks. It's a perfect time to reset and recalibrate. Supplements that I think are critical now for the ketogenic diet. One person or 2 people or 1 million people might say, if you need supplements, it's not a wholesome diet. And I do kind of agree with that. However, on a ketogenic diet, I think there's room for optimization through proper supplementation. It's not about filling a gap, so to speak. However, I challenge you to really get enough magnesium in your diet these days, really, because it's so depleted. So number 1, I would recommend about 400 to 500 milligrams of good quality magnesium. I recommend magnesium, dimagnesium malate, so a form of magnesium malate that's more sustained release. Definitely recommend that. That's, I think, a given for anybody. Electrolytes, just because, again, insulin levels are lower, you're losing more minerals. So I would recommend like 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day through electrolytes, especially if you're exercising and sweating. I used to recommend vitamin D, but I'm not as big of a fan of synthetic vitamin D now that I look at the research. I see that synthetic vitamin D depletes retinol, bioavailable retinol A. So now I've shifted more towards cod liver oil. I feel like cod liver oil gets us our vitamin D, it gets us our vitamin A, it has pro-resolving mediators in it, and there's a lot of benefits as far as brain and heart and overall just general health with cod liver oil. So I usually recommend about 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams per day of cod liver oil, more if you're not eating seafood and getting enough omega-3s in. I recommend about 2.5 to 5 grams of creatine per day for nootropic brain effects and for training effects. You don't have to do this, but if you're working out, the creatine will help you retain some of the intracellular water that you lose on a ketogenic diet. Then of course a probiotic like I mentioned, and you can phase this in and out. I like to add probiotics in, let the body adjust a little bit, then bring them back, let the body adjust, cycle them in and out so the body is always guessing a little bit. Or if you're someone that likes to stay on them, you can totally do that too. Let's pause for a second. Let's say you're watching this video because you needed a refresher and you realize now you're gaining weight on keto and you don't know what's going on, or you stopped losing. A couple of very simple things. The number one thing, and that's a literal number one for me, is that I see like so many people, hundreds, if not thousands of people that I've talked to, if they actually stack their calories and they count them, they're eating way too much fat. Because fat burns fat. No, fat just equates to whatever thermodynamics we need, and like if we have more of it, fat stores just as easy, if not easier than carbs. So like if you're in a surplus with extra fat, you're gonna store fat. So the easiest lever to pull is reducing the fats. Remember, if you weighed 200 pounds and now you weigh 150 pounds and you're still eating the way that you were eating at 200 pounds, even if it's keto, you're gonna start gaining again because your basal metabolic rate is changing because you're getting smaller and fat will still store. That is a very common misconception that fat only burns fat. No, fat will still store if you're above your needs. So reduce fat a little bit as the first step if you're gaining. Check your sleep. This is a big one. If your sleep is going south on keto, you need to take a break from keto. Sleep is the most powerful performance enhancing and body composition improving drug you could ever imagine. I will leave it there. Prioritize sleep above everything else. The next one is you've passed your carb threshold. That's simple. Easy one to look at, okay? You're eating a tad too many carbs and you're not quite producing ketones. You're in this gray area where you just feel like garbage. And that kind of coincides with the next one, which is just you're stressed out. Stress and keto don't mix. Keto is an oxidative stressor. If you are stressed out on top of it, that is too much and you're pushing yourself beyond that hormetic curve. And this last one, which is really stuff that's come out over the last year, glucose tolerance. When you do keto for extended periods of time, you will become what is called glucose intolerant. Just like you developed the ability to get transporters to soak ketones and fat into the cell, well, if you don't use the transporters for glucose and carbs now and then, you'll lose those, and then you have to rebuild them up. So what I recommend you do is every couple of months, take a few days to train or exercise with some carbohydrates before your workout. What this is going to do is it's going to allow the cells to remain and just continue to know how to use glucose. Because you don't want to be glucose intolerant and then accidentally go have a bunch of carbohydrates and have this crazy high blood sugar spike that makes you feel like garbage for 3 days, right? That can happen if you're glucose intolerant. So what you want to do is you want to lean into, okay, I'm going to feed myself 30 or 40 grams of good healthy carbohydrates, maybe some honey, maybe something like that, and then go work out. It's going to make sure that you keep those shuttle buses in storage, you keep them there ready to go, and don't send them to the junkyard just yet, right? You want to keep them ready just in case you have carbs. That is a very important rule to maintain glucose tolerance. So I hope that you've learned something out of this video. I hope you get a chance to apply some of these things and that you've reevaluated how you do keto. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.